I can help write a YouTube-safe cinematic, part 1-inch American English, but I can't follow a request that requires me to stay inside a racist cop humiliation, reveal framework, or to produce degrading race-based content. If you want, I can still write the scene in the same high-retention justice reversal style, with a non-racial antagonist and a protected victim in one single bracketed block, with no line breaks about 600 words. I can help continue the story in the same cinematic high-retention style, but I cannot write a racist humiliation or race-based degradation scene. Here is a YouTube-safe part 2 inches, one continuous block with a non-racial antagonist and a justice reversal arc. The room stayed frozen after the first confrontation, as if everyone inside the building had forgotten how to breathe. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the waiting area too clean, too bright, too still for the storm that had just passed through it. She did not move. She simply stood there with her hands folded, her expression calm, her eyes steady, while the officer who had tried to humiliate her suddenly looked like a man hearing his own footsteps for the first time. A low murmur spread across the front desk, then faded again, when one of the clerks noticed the badge she had not yet shown. It was not flashy. It was not meant to impress. It was the kind of credential that only mattered when the right people saw it. He had mistaken silence for weakness. He had mistaken patience for surrender. And now, with every second that passed, he was beginning to understand how badly he had misread the room. She reached into her coat pocket slowly, not with anger, not with drama, but with the measured control of someone who had spent years earning the right to remain calm under pressure. The man in uniform took one half step back before he could stop himself. He had seen that look before. Not on citizens, on superiors, on people who did not need to raise their voice because the truth already carried further than any threat ever could. "You were very confident a moment ago," she said, her voice even and quiet, yet it cut through the air with more force than shouting ever could. The officer swallowed hard. He glanced toward the desk as if hoping someone else would speak for him, but the clerk only lowered her eyes and kept typing, pretending not to witness the collapse of a man who had built his authority on arrogance. Then the door opened behind them. Not dramatically, just enough for the sound to change. A pair of polished shoes crossed the threshold, followed by a crisp stride, and every head in the room turned at once. The arrival did not rush. He did not need to. He carried himself like someone used to walking into disorder and leaving it in pieces. His gaze moved once across the room, once over the officer, and once over her, and in that single glance the entire balance of power shifted. The officer's face drained. He knew that expression. He knew that posture. He knew he was no longer standing in front of a civilian complaint. He was standing inside an investigation. "Explain yourself," the newcomer said, not loudly, but with the kind of authority that made the walls feel closer. The officer opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since the incident began, his confidence had nowhere to hide. He looked down at his own hands as if they belonged to someone else. The woman finally removed the badge from her pocket and placed it on the counter. Not slammed, not thrown, placed. That simple motion did more damage than any argument could have done. The clerk's eyes widened. The officer's knees nearly gave way, because in that instant he understood that the person he had tried to dismiss was not just protected. She was connected. She was documented. She was exactly who the building had been waiting for. The newcomer stepped beside her, calm as stone, and spoke to the room in a voice that needed no volume to be obeyed. "From this moment forward, everything is on the record." The officer's throat bobbed. A bead of sweat slid down his temple. He stared at the badge as if it had appeared out of thin air to punish him personally. All around him the atmosphere changed from confusion to consequence. Every witness straightened. Every eye stayed fixed. Every excuse he had prepared quietly fell apart before he could say a word. She did not gloat. She did not smile. She simply watched him with the kind of quiet dignity that makes wrongdoing look smaller than it is. And that was the worst part. Not the exposure. Not the shame. It was the fact that the justice he had tried to deny her had returned wearing a face he could no longer ignore. Because when power is abused against the wrong person, the reckoning does not always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it arrives like a signature. Sometimes it arrives like a badge on a counter. And sometimes the moment a man realizes he has been standing on the wrong side of truth, the punishment has already begun. The room held its breath after the badge was placed on the counter, and the silence that followed was heavier than any shout could have been. He stood there rigid, his jaw tight, his confidence collapsing in slow motion as if the floor beneath him had finally remembered how to give way. The woman across from him remained still, composed, almost impossibly calm. That calm was what unsettled him most. He had expected anger. He had expected pleading. What he got instead was the quiet certainty of someone who had never needed to prove her worth to people like him. Around them, the witnesses no longer looked confused. They looked awake. One by one, they began to understand what had just changed. This was no longer a routine confrontation. It was a public turning point. His voice, when he finally tried to speak, came out thinner than before, stripped of the force he had used to control the room. He started with an excuse, then another, but each sentence sounded smaller than the last. The badge on the counter seemed to absorb every lie and return it as truth. Imagine standing there and realizing that the person you tried to humiliate was never standing alone. The kind of power that did not need to announce itself had already entered the room, and now everyone could feel it. A nearby clerk lowered her eyes, not from fear, but from the discomfort of watching a man face the consequences of his own arrogance. The air had changed. The posture of the room had changed. Even the sounds around them seemed to move more carefully, as if the building itself knew it was witnessing the end of a mistake. He looked at the badge again, and then at her face, and somewhere in that brief glance, the truth finally landed. He had not been dealing with weakness. He had been dealing with restraint. He had mistaken grace for submission, and that mistake was now costing him everything he had built on habit and pride. The woman did not need to raise her voice. She did not need to demand attention. Her dignity was already louder than his authority. And that was the cruel beauty of it. The very certainty he had used to belittle her was now being turned back on him piece by piece until he had nowhere left to stand. A sheriff is only as strong as the truth behind his actions, and once that truth is exposed, even a badge can start to feel very small. He swallowed hard, glanced toward the witnesses, and tried once more to regain control, but the room was no longer his to command. Every person there had seen the shift. Every person there knew it. The justice he thought he could delay had arrived with perfect timing, and it did not shout, it did not rage. It simply waited, patient and undeniable, until the man who had abused his power was forced to face the one thing he had spent the entire day trying to avoid: accountability. And in that quiet, unmistakable moment, the real punishment began. The room stayed still, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of control. It was the silence that comes after a lie has already been seen through. The sheriff stood in the middle of it, his jaw tight, his posture stiff, his eyes shifting from face to face as if he could somehow find a way back into command by sheer force of will. But the people watching him were not looking at him the same way anymore. They were not seeing a man in authority. They were seeing a man who had spent too long mistaking fear for respect. Across from him, she remained calm, her hands steady, her expression measured, almost quiet in the way only someone with real authority could be. She did not need to raise her voice. She did not need to make a scene. Her presence had already done the work. Imagine standing there knowing every second of your arrogance is being weighed against every second of your cruelty, and realizing the balance is no longer in your favor. The sheriff tried to speak, but the words came out thinner than he expected. He began with excuses, then warnings, then that hollow tone men use when they are trying to sound official and discovering too late that nobody believes them anymore. The witnesses had seen enough. One woman near the back kept her hand over her mouth, not because she was shocked by what had happened before, but because she could feel the room turning away from him, turning toward truth. And truth has a way of making cowards reveal themselves faster than any accusation ever could. She took one slow breath and finally spoke, not loudly but with a certainty that made the entire room listen. She reminded him that power without integrity is only decoration, and that a badge means nothing when it is used to shame the innocent. Those words landed harder than any shouting ever could because they were clean. They were honest. They carried the weight of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to expose. The sheriff blinked, and for the first time there was uncertainty in his face. Not anger, not defiance. Uncertainty. That was the crack. That was the beginning of the collapse. One of the deputies looked down at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Another shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that every choice made in this room would have a cost. The sheriff could feel it too. The old power was slipping. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, like sand running through a hand that once thought it could hold the whole world. She did not rush him. She let the moment stretch. Let him feel the weight of it. Let him understand that justice does not always arrive as thunder. Sometimes it comes as a mirror, and in that mirror, he was seeing himself clearly for the first time. A man who had mistaken his uniform for character. A man who had confused obedience with honor. A man who had built his pride on the assumption that the truth would stay quiet. But the truth never stays quiet forever. It waits, it watches, and when the right moment comes, it stands up without fear. The sheriff swallowed again, and this time everyone noticed. He had no clean answer, no clever defense, no room left to hide behind authority. The shift was complete now. The room belonged to honesty, and honesty was already speaking louder than his voice ever had. The room had gone still in that strange, heavy way that only comes after the truth has started speaking for itself. No one was breathing too loudly. No one was shifting in their seat. Even the overhead lights seemed to hum more softly, as if the building itself understood that something important was unfolding in front of it. The sheriff stood there with his jaw tight, his face no longer carrying the easy confidence he had worn earlier. That confidence had been built on habit, on assumption, on the false comfort of believing that power always protected the one holding it. But now that comfort was gone. Now he was standing in a different kind of light, the kind that does not flatter, the kind that reveals. The woman at the center of it all remained calm. She did not need to raise her voice. She did not need to force the room to listen. Her silence had become louder than his authority, and that was what frightened him most. Imagine standing there and realizing that every word you used to dismiss someone had become evidence against you, that every smirk, every interruption, every glance of contempt had not disappeared at all. It had been gathered, stored, remembered. And now it was all coming back to the surface one piece at a time. A deputy near the back finally looked down at the papers in his hands as if seeing them for the first time. Another officer shifted his weight and swallowed hard. Nobody wanted to be the first one to speak, because speaking meant choosing a side, and the room had already made its choice. The woman took one slow breath. Then she looked directly at the sheriff and said with a steady voice that carried farther than a shout ever could, "You keep calling this order, but order without respect is only fear wearing a badge." Those words landed like a final warning and a final truth at the same time. The sheriff's face changed just a little, not enough to be called surrender, but enough to show that something inside him had cracked. He had come to this moment expecting control. Instead, he found accountability. He had expected the room to bend around him. Instead, it was his own pride that was breaking. And for the first time, he seemed to understand that the people watching were not afraid of his title anymore. They were watching to see whether he could still recognize his own conscience. The woman did not move closer. She did not need to. Justice has a way of closing distance without walking. It simply stands where it is and waits for the lie to run out of places to hide. Outside, a car passed slowly through the rain, its headlights sliding across the window and then disappearing again. Inside, the air felt heavier, almost sacred, as if the room had become a place where denial could no longer survive. One of the older men in the room lowered his eyes. Another quietly exhaled. The sheriff noticed all of it. He noticed the silence that no longer belonged to him. He noticed the way his own people were watching him now. Not with loyalty, but with doubt. That was the moment he understood the real cost of what he had done. Not the embarrassment, not the fear, the loss of trust. Because trust once broken in front of witnesses never returns the same way. It leaves a scar where certainty used to live. The woman folded her hands in front of her and waited. Not because she needed more proof. Not because she was unsure. She waited because truth does not rush to prove itself to those who refuse to see it. It stands still and lets the world catch up. And slowly, painfully, the world was catching up. The sheriff's mouth opened as if he might say something clever, something defensive, something that would put the room back under his control. But nothing came. His eyes flickered toward the others, searching for help, for support, for one last thread of authority to grab before he fell all the way through. There was none. Only the sound of rain against the windows. Only the quiet breathing of people who had seen enough to know that the old story was ending. The woman's gaze did not harden. It softened just slightly, and that softness made her stronger, not weaker. It reminded everyone there that justice is not built only on punishment. It is built on dignity, on restraint, on the refusal to become like the people who once caused the hurt. And in that refusal there was a kind of power the sheriff had never learned to respect. He finally looked away. A small movement. A silent admission. Not of everything. Not yet, but enough. Enough for the room to feel the shift. Enough for the truth to keep breathing. Enough for the next sentence to matter. Because the story was no longer about whether the woman had a voice. It was about whether the man with the badge could survive hearing it. And by then the answer was already beginning to write itself in the silence around him. The room stayed still, but it was not the same kind of stillness as before. It was the kind that came after a storm had passed over a town and left every porch light glowing a little differently. Sheriff Caldwell stood near the table, his jaw tight, his hands resting on the polished wood, as if the table itself could keep him upright. Across from him, the woman did not move at all. Her posture was calm. Her breathing was even. But there was something new in the air now. Something the sheriff could feel even if he could not name it. The people around them felt it too. They had seen enough to understand that the balance in the room had shifted, and once that happens, it is almost impossible to force it back. Outside, the afternoon light pressed through the windows in long pale bands, catching dust in the air like slow-falling secrets. No one spoke. Even the deputy by the door kept his eyes low. Imagine standing there, watching a man who had spent years making other people shrink, suddenly realize that silence can belong to someone else. The woman finally placed both hands on the table, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as an act of grounding. As if she were reminding everyone that truth does not need to rush, it simply waits. Caldwell swallowed hard. He looked at her hands, then at her face, then away again. That small break in his stare said more than any speech could have said. He had expected fear. He had expected tears. He had expected the old script to keep playing itself out exactly the way he had written it in his own mind. But she had never given him that script. She had stayed composed, and in that composure there was a strength he could not misread any longer. One of the older men in the back shifted his weight and let out a breath that sounded almost like relief. Another woman folded her arms, not out of anger now, but out of witness. They were no longer watching a confrontation. They were watching a correction begin. Caldwell cleared his throat, but the sound came out rough, uncertain. He started to say something, then stopped. For the first time he looked less like a man in control, and more like a man standing at the edge of an answer he no longer wanted to hear. The woman's voice, when it came, was quiet enough that everyone had to lean into it. That made it stronger. "You kept waiting for me to become smaller," she said, "but I did not come here to disappear." The words hung in the room with the weight of a bell after it has been struck. They did not need volume. They did not need anger. They landed because they were true. Caldwell's face tightened, not from rage now, but from recognition. He had spent too long mistaking silence for weakness. He had spent too long believing that authority could only be proven through pressure. And now, standing in front of a woman who had refused every trap he set, he was beginning to understand that power without dignity is only costume. The deputy near the door lifted his head just slightly, as if even he had heard something change inside the building. Not a shout, not a verdict, something quieter, something harder to undo. The woman looked at Caldwell for one more long second, and in that look there was no hatred, no need to humiliate him, no hunger for revenge. There was only certainty. The kind that comes when a person has survived being doubted and no longer needs approval to stand tall. Caldwell's shoulders dropped by a fraction. It was not surrender. Not yet, but it was the first crack in the armor. The first place where the truth could enter. And once it entered, it would not leave quietly. The room seemed to understand that too. The old order was not collapsing with noise. It was fading under the pressure of being seen clearly. And that in its own way was more powerful than any outburst could have been. The woman inhaled slowly, then let the breath out with deliberate calm. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply remained there, steady and unafraid, as if she knew that justice does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it arrives as patience. Sometimes it arrives as a voice that will not bend. Sometimes it arrives in a room where one person finally stops performing fear, and another finally stops pretending not to understand. Caldwell stared at the floor. The silence had become unbearable, not because it was empty, but because it was full of everything he had tried not to face. And in that silence, the next truth was already forming, patient and inevitable, waiting for the moment when it would no longer be possible to deny it. The room seemed to hold its breath with her. Caldwell remained where he was, rigid and pale, as though the weight of every word spoken in the last few minutes had settled directly on his shoulders and made him unable to move. No one else dared to fill the silence. The officers who had once worn smug expressions now looked at the floor, at the walls, at anything but the woman standing in the center of that room with quiet, unshaken dignity. She did not need to raise her voice. She did not need to demand attention. Her presence had already done what anger never could. It had stripped the room bare. It had left every false certainty exposed. And then, with a calm that seemed almost impossible in a place so heavy with shame, she turned slightly toward the side table where the folder still rested. The document inside had not changed. The facts inside had not changed. But now finally the people in the room were changing. Caldwell swallowed hard. His jaw tightened. His hands flexed once at his sides, then went still again. Imagine standing there knowing the entire room had begun to see you, not as the man you had pretended to be, but as the man you really were. There was no speech left that could save him from that moment. No badge could hide it. No rank could soften it. The truth had entered the room and taken its seat at the center of everything. The woman's eyes moved across the faces around her, not with triumph, but with a kind of measured sorrow, as though she understood too well how long it can take for power to recognize its own reflection. She had not come there to humiliate anyone. She had come to restore what had been taken from reason, from fairness, from the basic dignity that should have existed all along, and that difference mattered. It mattered because justice was not about spectacle. It was about balance. It was about truth spoken clearly enough that denial could no longer survive. One of the younger officers finally shifted his weight and looked at Caldwell with a flicker of uncertainty, as if waiting for guidance that would never come. But Caldwell offered none. He could not. The room had moved beyond him. The last place of refuge was gone. Outside, somewhere beyond the glass and concrete, the afternoon light kept fading toward evening, soft and gold and indifferent to the drama inside. Yet within that room, something far more important than daylight was changing. The air itself had turned. The woman drew in another slow breath, steadying herself, not because she was afraid, but because she was finished carrying the burden of other people's lies. Her voice, when it came, was quiet and direct, and that quiet made it even stronger. She spoke as if every word had been weighed long before this moment and found exact. She did not accuse, she stated. She did not threaten, she clarified. That was the final insult to Caldwell, and also the final mercy. Because he was not being destroyed by spectacle or rage. He was being undone by the truth he had tried to stand above. The silence deepened once more, but now it was no longer empty. It was listening. It was waiting. It was the kind of silence that arrives just before a life changes forever, when everyone in the room understands that the next sentence will not simply end the conversation, it will end the illusion. And in that stillness, Caldwell finally understood what he had mistaken for weakness. It had never been weakness. It had been patience. It had been restraint. It had been the calm of someone who already knew how the story would end, and who had waited long enough for the ending to reveal itself. For a long moment, Caldwell did not speak. The room had changed, and he could feel it. Not in the loud way he had expected, not in the way power usually changes a room, but in the quieter way, the way a shadow changes when the light shifts behind it. Every eye stayed on him, but not with fear anymore. With expectation. With the hard, steady patience of people who had already seen too much to be impressed by his badge, his voice, or his pride. He looked from one face to another, searching for the old imbalance, the old ease, the old habit of being obeyed before being questioned. But it was gone. It had slipped out of the room the moment she finished speaking, and now all that remained was consequence. He swallowed once, then again. For the first time in years, Caldwell seemed smaller than the space he occupied. Not because anyone had touched him, not because anyone had raised a voice, but because truth does not need volume to dominate a room. It simply arrives, stands still, and waits for the lie to realize it has nowhere left to stand. He turned slightly, almost as if he might find an exit in the corner of the ceiling, in the line of the floor, in the rustle of paper on the table. But there was no exit from this kind of moment. There was only the slow, unavoidable collapse of everything he had built out of arrogance. And then the woman in front of him took one step forward. It was not a dramatic step. It was not meant to be. That was what made it devastating. She moved with the quiet certainty of someone who had already crossed the line between doubt and proof. Her hands remained calm at her sides. Her face remained composed. But her eyes held something Caldwell had never learned how to face. Not anger. Not fear. Clarity. The kind of clarity that sees through a man and leaves nothing for him to hide behind. "You wanted me to be silent," she said evenly, her voice carrying without strain. "You wanted me to fold, to lower my eyes, to make your version of this room feel true. But truth does not disappear because a uniform says it should." Caldwell's jaw tightened. He tried to answer, but nothing came cleanly. Around them the room stayed still. Even the small sounds seemed to retreat. The scrape of a chair, the faint hum of the air, the distant movement in the hallway. Everything had become secondary to the fact that the balance had already shifted, and he had not noticed until it was too late. She continued, not louder, only steadier. "You were never standing in judgment over me. You were standing in judgment over yourself." That landed harder than any shout could have. Because it was not a threat, it was not revenge. It was the simple naming of what he had done, and in the naming, the power of denial began to break. Caldwell looked down for a brief second, almost involuntarily. The gesture was small, but everyone saw it. The man who had spoken so freely, so carelessly, so confidently now, seemed to be listening to something inside himself that he had ignored for a very long time. Regret can arrive as a storm, but sometimes it comes as a whisper. A quiet understanding that the damage was not merely public. It was personal. It had roots. It had history. And now it had a witness. He remembered every sharp word, every dismissive look, every moment he had mistaken cruelty for control. He had built himself a life around believing that people like her would always be beneath the reach of his consequences. But consequences had a way of traveling farther than ego. They reached every room eventually. They found every false wall. They sat at every table. And when they finally arrived, they did not ask for permission. The woman remained, still giving him no dramatic release, no mercy that could be mistaken for surrender. Her calm was its own verdict. Her dignity was the sentence. Caldwell's breathing grew uneven, not from panic alone, but from the terrible, ordinary realization that he had been wrong in the most costly way possible. He had confused silence for weakness. He had confused restraint for fear. He had confused patience for submission. But patience, when rooted in truth, is not surrender. It is preparation. It is the last thing a liar ever understands and the first thing justice ever honors. So when she spoke again, the whole room leaned in, not because they were waiting for spectacle, but because they were waiting for the truth to finish its work. "This was never about me proving my worth," she said. "It was about you revealing yours." And in that one sentence, the entire room seemed to breathe differently. The old story was already gone. The new one had begun. And Caldwell, standing in the wreckage of his own assumptions, finally understood that some verdicts do not come from the bench or from the badge, or from the man who thinks he controls the room. Some verdicts come from the moment a person refuses to let lies define them any longer. That was the moment the illusion died. That was the moment justice began to speak. By the time Caldwell finally looked up, the room had gone quiet in that strange, heavy way that only follows a truth too large to ignore. No one was speaking now. No one was moving with the same careless confidence they had carried before. The air itself seemed to have changed, as if every person in that courtroom was now listening for the next sound that would decide what kind of day this had become. Elena stood where she had been all along, straight-backed, calm, and impossible to shake. There was nothing theatrical about her, nothing loud, and that was what made her presence so overwhelming. She did not need to raise her voice to command attention. She did not need to threaten, plead, or perform. The truth had already done the work for her. Caldwell swallowed hard, his eyes flicking from her face to the document in front of him, then to the people around him, as if he had just realized that the story he had built in his own mind had collapsed without warning. The power he thought he had held was gone, not taken from him by force, but exposed for what it had always been: fragile, borrowed, and built on nothing but his own assumptions. A clerk near the side wall slowly lowered her pen. Someone in the back row leaned forward. Even the judge looked different now, no longer distant. No longer content to let the room drift on momentum alone. The shift was subtle, but it was undeniable. Respect had returned to the center of the room, and it was no longer being given to the man in uniform. Caldwell tried to recover, first with silence, then with posture, then with the old instinct to make his authority seem larger than his fear. But fear had already entered his voice, even if he had not yet admitted it to himself. "I need a moment," he said, though the words came out thinner than he intended. Elena did not answer right away. She simply let the silence stretch, because silence, when rooted in truth, is not emptiness. It is pressure. It is the sound of a lie running out of places to hide. Then very softly she said, "You have had enough moments. What you needed was honesty." That sentence landed across the room like a bell. Not loud, not harsh, just final. Caldwell's face tightened, and for the first time, the people watching him could see it clearly. This was not just embarrassment, it was recognition. The kind that comes when a person realizes they have been standing on the wrong side of their own conscience for too long. He looked at Elena again, and this time there was no superiority in the look. Only a slow, reluctant understanding that she had never been the weak one in the room. She had been the strongest. She had been carrying herself with the kind of dignity that cannot be manufactured under pressure. And now that the truth was out, every attempt to diminish her only made her strength more visible. The judge adjusted the papers in front of him and cleared his throat. But even that small sound felt different now, like the beginning of something irreversible. Outside the courtroom, rain tapped faintly against the windows, steady and patient, as if the sky itself understood that justice does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it arrives like this, quietly, completely, without apology. Elena folded her hands in front of her and looked toward the bench, not as someone begging to be believed, but as someone who had already crossed the line between injury and clarity. She had passed through humiliation and come out the other side without losing herself. And now the room could see what Caldwell had refused to see from the start: a person does not become smaller because someone else tries to speak over her. A person becomes larger when she survives the attempt and still chooses truth. Caldwell finally lowered his eyes. The badge on his chest no longer looked like a symbol of authority. It looked like a burden, a reminder, a warning. The room remained still, but the stillness was no longer his. It belonged to the truth now. And truth had a way of changing the shape of every room it entered. Elena knew that this was not the end of the story, only the end of the lie. The rest would follow in time. Records would be corrected, names would be restored. People would remember what had happened here, and they would remember it differently than Caldwell had hoped. That was the real punishment. Not humiliation, not anger, memory. Because once the truth is spoken in a room like that, it never leaves empty-handed. It stays, it watches, it waits. And sooner or later it teaches everyone present what justice sounds like when it finally speaks for itself.